Chapter 2. Wait, let me start over. The last night of my summer internship, Dr. Wang, the head of the intern program, and I had to physically restrain Dr. Frank, the owner of FFI, so she wouldn't cause a scene. She's actually the reason I wanted to get into embryo research. I read a book by her I found in the library on a cold night when I was trying to stay out of the streets and keep warm for as long as I could. It was called The Frankenstein Dilemma, A Future Without Men. And the way she interrogated how to do away with the need for sperm entirely was nothing short of miraculous. In fact, no one even knew her given last name. Everyone had been told to call her Dr. Frank because she had been determined since reading Shelby's masterpiece and cautionary tale that she would figure out a way to create bodies without sperm. Even without that book, Dr. Frank was at the top of her field, absolutely instrumental in changing how we now think of IVF and embryo sculpting. I was impressed also to learn she was an Asian queer scientist in the southern United States of all places. I would be lying if I didn't admit I hoped to follow in her footsteps. Even though Dr. Frank was well regarded for that book, there was also a lot of controversy surrounding the kind of science she encouraged emerging scientists to explore. Before getting the internship, I went to a talk she gave. During the talkback, an audience member asked what she thought of the ethical dilemma of designer babies. Similar to what animal breeders do, but of course, made much more complex and ethically ambiguous given the science involved human embryos. A smug expression fell across Dr. Frank's face, as though even the question itself bemused her. Dr. Frank cleared her throat before she began adjusting her pristinely starched men's shirt. Oh, well, yes, of course there are ethical concerns with what I'm suggesting, but one could say that about the entire field of reproductive science. That's why the conservatives have been trying to cut IVF funding for decades. These are new times, and they require new means of innovation. For thinking beyond that to which we've grown accustomed, men are, it would seem, finally on their way out, she said with a chuckle, as much of the audience and the moderator laughed alongside her. I looked back at the audience member who seemed a bit embarrassed, smiling awkwardly as he returned the microphone to its stand in the aisle and made his way to his seat. A middle-aged man, perhaps in his 50s, pierced the room with his voice. "You can't be fucking serious," he yelled. He said more, but it was unintelligible because a security guard had covered his mouth while another guard grabbed him by the arms and led him out of the room. I wish I had attended with a fellow colleague who might have whispered their reaction in my ear like so many audience members in the auditorium. Years later, I would think back to the moment of that man's question and realize she never answered him. I wonder what became of that dissenter. I'm sure there were many more where he came from. During the last month of my work at the lab, I saw Dr. Wang gossip with the other techs that had been there far longer than me. The whispers seemed to grow louder as ones attached to scandal tend to. I could tell people were alarmed and uncomfortable with what they'd been hearing. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but I heard something about a breakdown and her biggest donors pulling funding. I didn't want my idol to shatter before my eyes, but I couldn't help being curious about what was behind all the whispers. All I knew was something was clearly wrong with Dr. Frank, and I wasn't altogether sure I wanted to know what it was. And then, on the last night of my internship, as we were wrapping up for the night, Dr. Frank blew into the lab like a rash, wild-eyed, and pink-faced, her perfectly coiffed hair as frazzled as what seemed to be her state of mind. Her outfit, as always, was elegant and well-tailored. She wore a deep violet suit with a bright green men's shirt. The shirt was untucked, and her thin floral necktie was a bit off-kilter, one of the few signs, other than her unkempt hair and complexion, that something was off. Dr. Wang acted fast. She untied her lab apron and threw it to the side. I followed suit. She gestured to me to hold down Dr. Frank's right arm while she held her left. Initially, I was a bit caught off guard that Dr. Frank didn't make any move to resist us. Her teeth clacked against one another, and her skin was frigid to the touch, and remained so, even after we walked her outside in the blistering southern heat. Not a drop of sweat gathered on her skin. I have to admit, even as I tried to maintain my composure, I was unnerved by her freezing skin, the accelerated speed at which her eyes darted back and forth, like someone on the verge of a mental break. When living on the streets as a runaway teen, you learn a thing or two about how little it takes for people to snap. Whatever was going on, she wasn't well. She kept looking behind her, and I couldn't be sure if she was itching for someone to find her or petrified that they would. I didn't have enough information myself to make any kind of assessment about whether it was a rightful suspicion or paranoid delusion, or both. Dr. Wang gripped her hand as I finished locking up the lab, securing it with the code on the keypad and my thumbprint. We walked her straight to the bathroom in the pub down the street, threw some cold water on her face, and wet her hair back. Dr. Wang took both Dr. Frank's hands into hers a bit awkwardly, as it was obvious their relationship hadn't yet earned this kind of intimacy. "Breathe," Dr. Wang commanded, forcefully rubbing her fingers with Dr. Frank's. "But you don't understand. I have to get out of here. It could be anywhere," Dr. Frank began in a heightened, accelerated tone of voice. "Listen to me," Dr. Wang started, then stopped. She walked over to each of the bathroom stalls, squatted to look underneath to ensure no stall was occupied. "Look, I'm not saying I don't believe you. Everything I've heard, who knows what's true? But whatever you're referring to, it's not going to come in here, that's for sure. And out there, anywhere around the lab, you don't, people are talking. You're already losing donors because of the rumors. No one's going to give their money to a queer woman of color who might be going crazy. In the South. You know this more than I do, okay?" Dr. Frank didn't nod, but she didn't interrupt or protest. Dr. Wang continued. "This is what I think we should do. How about you go home with Lee, the intern? She's wonderful, and I guarantee you have her utmost discretion. I'd take you with me, but, I have kids and a partner at home. Let's get a bite to eat first, because I think food might calm you down a bit, and also so as not to arouse suspicion. Then Lee will take you to her apartment, where you can get some rest, and we will discuss everything else in due time. I doubt whoever is following you will know to look for you there." Dr. Frank's breathing had slightly slowed by this point. She took her hands away from Dr. Wang's and placed her left in her suit coat pocket, as always, while the other smoothed down her wet hair. She nodded. Dr. Wang, very much in charge, led us out of the bathroom. Dr. Wang was right. If she stayed in the lab in that state, a tech or janitor would most likely have reported her. Who knows where she would have ended up? Maybe they would have called the police, had her arrested, or even institutionalized. A great mind like hers? What a fucking tragedy that would be. Like Claudel sequestered just as she hit her prime. Not on my watch. At least, not if there was anything I could do about it. Dr. Wang tried to normalize things at dinner. She introduced us, and Dr. Frank about the work I had been doing. And told Dr. Frank about the work I'd been doing. Over a comforting meal of burgers and ciders, her brown face began to recede back to its normal shade, and her chestnut brown hair, just a touch or two lighter than mine, resumed its usual relaxed position as it gradually dried and fell away from her face, but she still didn't utter a single word. After dinner, we caravanned in 2 cars to my apartment. The lab had furnished me with a generous stipend that allowed for comfortable housing. I'd already paid through the next month, since I was still debating my next move. And honestly, hanging around in the hopes FFI would take me on in a more permanent capacity. And so it was that I took care of Dr. Frank, my superior and my idol, for the next few days as she slept on my pull-out sofa. I tried to offer her my bed, but she refused with a vigorous shake of her head. I fed her soup dumplings and beef noodle soup. I had picked up earlier that day from a local dumpling house, and offered her constant water and cocooned her in blankets in hopes it would ease the chill determined to rest in her bones. At times, I inquired about Dr. Frank's level of comfort or if she had finished a mug of tea or bowl of soup I'd offered her. She just nodded or shook her head accordingly. After a few days, the initial wildness in her fell away little by little, and she finally began to look like the version of her I was most familiar with from afar. On those rare occasions when she would breeze through the lab with prospective donors, or from the many videos I watched of the talks she gave around the world, the warmth returned to her cheeks. After asking for her permission, I touched her skin to check for fever or prolonged chills. I was pleased as temperature no longer made me recoil inwardly in shock. On the 5th day, she finally spoke for the first time since Dr. Wang had silenced her panic-stricken cries. I was so eager to talk to her, but also somewhat hesitant to ask what it was that had transformed her into such a frenzied, distressed creature, that initially I only viewed her from my own obsessively inquisitive lens. After all, this was my chance to ask the person I admired most in the world anything I wanted. When would I get that exposure to an expert like Dr. Frank again? I asked about her research, and she seemed relieved by the opportunity to speak about it. After so many days of absolute silence, I was struck by the smooth eloquence with which she spoke, and moved by how forthcoming she was with her ideas and research. What led her to the field of study, how she developed her game-changing hypothesis. I, on the other hand, became so starstruck I could barely get words out fast enough as I tried to shove 50 words at once out of my awkwardly small mouth. Inadvertently, my sentences were accompanied by an agitated stutter. Wow! She smiled gracefully as I stumbled over myself in excitement and fervor, responding as though I were her colleague and not an awkward fan geeking out. It felt like a dream come true, and yet, at times, it felt selfish and narcissistic to only consider what knowledge I could gain from someone so clearly in pain. She asked me about my own studies, and even though Dr. Wang had told her all of this when we first met, I didn't mind refreshing her memory. She seemed particularly intrigued by my being a runaway teen, an aspect of my story not even Dr. Wang knew, and one I didn't anticipate revealing so quickly. She was very curious to hear how I transitioned from the streets to such a prestigious position. I could tell it sparked something in her that related to whatever she currently grappled with, but I tried not to pry. Eventually, though, leaning toward me with an elbow on each knee, Dr. Frank forced my hands. You've been very sweet to not meddle in my affairs, especially given how generous you were to offer your wonderful home as my hiding place. But I can tell you're dying to know what's behind my peculiar behavior, and exactly what I'm hiding from. I'm no fool. I know everyone in the lab is talking about me. Scientists try to act above such pettiness, but they gossip just as much as the next person, maybe even more. She smiled, looking directly into my eyes with candor. I hadn't seen her expressed thus far, and gave me a little wink. The wind held tight inside me, collapsed as though I'd been holding my breath for days. I cleared my throat, unsure of how to respond. Yeah, well, of course, I've heard little whispers here and there, but I try to just focus on my work and move on. But please, if you want to talk about what's going on for you, I'm happy to listen. I placed my hand on her knee in a somewhat forced attempt to offer compassion instead of voyeurism. She smiled. I do want to tell you my story, if for nothing more than to warn you, for I feel there is something in our stories, what I can intimate of yours at this point anyway, that unites each to each. Maybe the only good that can come of what happened to me is the potential to help another, like you. I can see that dangerous twinkle in your eye already. It would mean something to me if I could at least save a fellow scientist and an inquisitive mind like yours from a future of torment. I giggled out of recognition. This is no laughing matter, but oh, I remember what it was to be you, so young, headstrong, the world at your fingers. You don't know what I mean yet, but I think you'll see, once I tell you all there is to say. I was puzzled by her introduction to whatever she was preparing to tell me. It was ominous, but like she said, I was young, naive, and too full of the elixir of ambition to even guess what she was hinting at. Now it was her turn to reach towards me. Her eyes returned to a bit of their earlier wildness as she tried to implore me to receive what she would divulge. I also felt that with the intensity of her gaze, she was testing me as well, trying to see if I could handle it. I did my best to return her gaze, but I was so enthralled by her that it was hard to focus once I felt the skin of her hand. A soft tingle of electricity shot up my arm, but I tried to appear as nonchalant and earnest as possible. I couldn't help but want it to mean something, that I was special enough to be touched, that only I was privileged enough to hear her story. After Ma, after Ba, after Ko, it was hard not to find myself drawn to her, if only because someone as important as she seemed drawn to me. It didn't occur to me not to get ahead of myself, to even wait to hear what she had to tell me before riding the train of hope and anticipation. I knew what I wanted it to mean. Rookie mistake. Dr. Frank excused herself and left the room. My heart dropped to my stomach as I assumed I had ruined everything with my insecurities and pride. My one chance to connect with my idol. Before I could sink too far into my own self-shaming, she returned with an old tape recorder and box of unused cassettes, still protected in their shrink wrap. I want to tell you the entire story. If anything happens to me, promise me that you will share the story with the world. I nodded solemnly. That's when she began to tell me what happened to her, a story so akin to my own, and yet which took turns so frighteningly separate, that I feel I have no other recourse but to share it. Besides, there's no way to tell my story without telling hers too. Just as she did all those years ago, now I too feel compelled to share it in the hopes it will keep others from the choices that took me down my own foreboding path. Perhaps communication with another is the only thing we have to keep us from the darker depths of fate.